I want to go now with this discussion is, what happens if one of these three players pops and the Spurs really want to add them to the team for the coming season, and who are the players that they would have to look at, maybe possibly waiving or trading to open up a spot for those players. So let's first talk about Minix. So we did see Minix just a bit in summer league. I think he was injured to begin the summer league, so he didn't get into like the last 2 games of summer league, and he was pretty interesting. Played more like that 3-4 kind of role, kind of like a shooter. Did a little bit with the ball, as a secondary or third playmaking option. But again, he was just kind of interesting. The fact that his main skill that he's going to bring to the team is outside shooting, and so he would be interesting to watch in terms of. I thought he was going to get a one of those Austin contracts, maybe like one of those 2A spots, but that they ended up filling up the roster, and so the only spot there for him was a training camp contract. So again, Minix has a long road. The fact that he's a rookie, hasn't had any actual NBA experience aside from summer league, who would need to really pop off in a preseason and training camp to impress the Spurs so much that they would be willing to waive one of their current players or trade one of their current players to open up a spot for him. Then there's Malachi Flynn. He was mainly with I think it was Toronto for most of his career. Then he spent some time with the Knicks, like I mentioned. Then he ended up in Detroit. We saw that he had a really good game in Detroit. I think it was like a 50-point game or something like that, 48-point game at one point with Detroit. But we know that he hasn't been doing that for his whole career. So it didn't really work out for him on his rookie deal in Toronto, so they ended up moving him via trade, and you can tell that the Pistons, even a rebuilding team, didn't have any interest in bringing him back because they waived his bird rights this offseason to let him basically sign anywhere because they wanted to open up so much cap space to use for other free agent moves. And so Flynn's an interesting player because he is a veteran player, but he's still on barely ending his rookie scale contract. He plays more of the point guard and shooting guard spots, and more so like a combo guard. So again, he's an interesting option. I do want to mention though, for the position that he's looking at, whether it's a point guard or a shooting guard on the Spurs' team, that spot on the roster is kind of, there's a lot of players there already getting minutes. There's going to be Chris Paul, there's going to be Stephon Castle, there's going to be Trey Jones. Then you have other veterans like Malachi Branham, Blake Wesley still on the team. So there's a lot of players at those two guard spots that it's going to be a really tough task for Malachi Flynn to really impress in preseason and training camp, and also the preseason, to try to get the Spurs to open up a roster spot for him. And then the last player was that newest addition. That's BJ Boston from the Clippers. He plays more so like a small forward / like shooting guard kind of role. And even that position, I would say on the roster is pretty packed here. Like the Spurs are going to have some players who don't get minutes on certain nights. Maybe a guy like Julian Champagnie or a guy like Malachi Branham, players that should be getting some minutes. They have such a loaded roster right now that it's going to be tough for even those kind of players to get some minutes there at the 3 or the 2. And so, with players like Devin Vassell still on the roster, you got Harrison Barnes coming in if you're the Spurs. You have Stephon Castle, who can play some 2 guard as well. So there's a lot of options there for San Antonio that for BJ Boston, it's going to be tough for him as well to try to, he has to really impress with limited minutes in the preseason and training camp. And then try to get the Spurs to waive or trade someone to open up a spot for him. So that's kind of the conundrum that these 3 players, these invites to training camp, currently sit in, is that they not only do they have to play really well, they have to play so well that the Spurs are willing to either trade someone and not bring salary back, so that way they can open up a roster spot for this player, or waive someone flat out on a contract, that's on a guaranteed contract, and in order to give one of these players a roster spot. So again, that's something to watch whenever training camps do start in October, and the preseason schedule comes out with those first 5 games of the preseason, to see if one of these 3 players, try to make the Spurs, open a roster spot for them. And so, one thing I would say is, let's just say that one of these 3 players had a very impressive training camp and preseason, and the Spurs just cannot let this player go, and they need to have this player on the roster, whether it's Boston, Minix, or Flynn. So let's just say that in this hypothetical scenario that happens, right? The Spurs don't want to they want one of these players on the roster. They can't just waive them and let some other NBA team sign them. So then we get to that question of, okay, well then, who are the Spurs going to waive or trade, to open up a roster spot for that player? And so again, we don't know the answer to that question right now. I would just first of all look at the financial cap sheet, and I would say, first of all, who are the lowest, the players with the 3 lowest cap holds, or not cap holds, but cap hits on the Spurs' roster in the event that the Spurs either traded that player or they waive that player. So the players with the 3 lowest cap hits would be Sidi Sissoko, Who, he had a kind of an up and down summer league. It wasn't entirely his fault. He basically said that he was coming off off-season surgery that he had. So he really, he played on pretty much almost all the games for the Spurs. I think he only missed a handful of games, but he kind of showed his versatility on the defensive end. His outside shot wasn't quite there. We saw his passing ability, both running the ball in the pick and roll and in the open court, was something very, very interesting. But again, he kind of had an up and down summer league play. But what's interesting about Sissoko and why he might be a keeper on the Spurs is the fact that Pop, gave a TV interview during one of the games when he went on the broadcast, and he had some very glowing remarks about Sidi Sissoko and kind of the potential for his future down the road. So again, maybe if the reason, even though Sissoko has the lowest contract amount, the Spurs may end up keeping him just because of going based off of what Pop said, the fact that they have more so future plans for him in terms of his player development. So again, maybe that's why he might be a safe option to stay on the team despite his summer league play. There's also the two players that the Spurs re-signed over the summer. They were two of the last signees. That's Sandro Mamukelashvili and Charles Bassey. And I'm only mentioning their names because after Sissoko, they have the lowest contract amounts. They're signed to veteran minimum deals that they re-signed with the Spurs for. So again, if the Spurs, it looks like they really like Mamu, obviously, as an option there for depth at the four. So I think that if they were to have to waive him to add one of these players, then they're losing a position there. Someone who can play some of the four or backup five on the team in the event that there's like an injury or someone's out of the lineup for a period of time. Then there's also Charles Bassey. He was dealing with injury last season where he got injured after playing a few weeks into the season, and then he had to miss the rest of the season. Well, the Spurs obviously wanted him back on the team, so they re-signed him after having to trade him to I think he got traded. I don't remember how he ended up leaving they had to waive him. They had to waive him in order to open up some cap space to add in, to bring in Harrison Barnes and also Chris Paul. So Bassey got waived, and then they re-signed him when they found out that no other teams had signed him yet. He was still there, out as a free agent, and so they brought him back at the veteran minimum. But again, if you waive Bassey just because you need to open up a roster spot, well, then he's pretty much like your third backup center on the roster right now. You have Wemby at the 5, you have Zach Collins at the 5, and then after that, I would say it's pretty much Charles Bassey who's the third big on this current roster. So again, you're really taking away from your depth in the front court if you were to have to waive one of either Mamu or Bassey. So again, those questions only come around in the event that Minix, Flynn, or Boston Jr. really impress, and the Spurs really want to have those three players on the roster, as the season comes up here in late October. So again, that's kind of